Welcome to Solidarity Live. I'm Alex Lawson, and with me, as always, is my wonderful co-host, Jocelyn. Jocelyn, we have a great show today. We're going to probably go over some more of the horrible things that are happening all over and be angry about them. But I actually think opening up with talking about one of the most horrible entities out there, which is the pharmaceutical corporations, but how there is actually a whole nother path with public pharma that I think we're closer to than we've ever been before. So that's a hopeful part that we can talk about on Solidarity Live today. So Jocelyn, I don't know if you want to correct me on the sort of.
I don't know. It's kind of weird to hear you speak positively about big pharma. What is going on, Alex?
No. It's positively about destroying the entire model completely and building something new for the people on the wreckage of it.
Well, with that in mind, we are here with Zain Rizvi of Public Citizen, and he has a wonderful background in being a public health warrior and generally fighting the pharmaceutical monopoly powers that be. So we want to talk a lot today, as much ground as we can cover, about the pharmaceutical response to COVID, the inappropriate and terrifying way that has played out, but also just the broader trends that have led us to where we are now. Zain, hi, how are you?
Hi, Jocelyn. Hi, Alex. Thanks for having me.
So we chatted earlier in the week and we were talking about a report you wrote for Public Citizen about the way remdesivir has been sort of weaponized. And can you, I mean, it's such a big topic, but can you start us off a little bit about that?
Sure. So let me just, even before getting to remdesivir, let me just kind of give a background for your viewers. The way the pharmaceutical industry works in, modern times, it's basically universities, public agencies do a lot of the critical work, especially early stage, but increasingly in the later stages of drug development. And once they do this work, which is, taxpayer funded, it is then essentially handed over to these pharmaceutical corporations with almost no strings attached. And as a result, despite the fact that the US taxpayer literally, is funding, close to $40 billion in R&D from the National Institutes of Health alone, the US taxpayer is compensated for this investment with some of the highest drug prices in the world. And so it's a system that's completely out of whack. And one reason it's so misguided or skewed is because of monopolies, pharmaceutical monopolies. And so what we explored in the Remdesivir report is actually a separate angle of the same sort of beast. When you award a corporation monopoly, you allow the corporation to both set the price, but you also allow the corporation to dictate supply, because that one corporation is the only corporation that can sell the drug in question. And so remdesivir is an experimental treatment. It's not a panacea. It reduces time to recovery. So it has modest benefit. But in the middle of a pandemic, modest benefit is important. And unfortunately, in this country and all around the world, actually, we're seeing massive remdesivir shortages. And the reason for that, in part, is because only one corporation, Gilead Sciences, is selling remdesivir in the United States at this moment.
Well, oh, sorry, Alex, you go.
Well, if you want to go more on remdesivir, I think take that. But because I'd like to zoom out sort of faster, because remdesivir is actually, it's great. As you said, in the middle of a pandemic, anything. There's two treatments that have shown promise. Old steroid has reduced mortality enormously. And I think we are starting to see those numbers come through, that hospitalization is staying the same, but death rates slowly going down in America. It's wonderful. And remdesivir shortens a hospital stay. But it's actually, I want to get to the bigger thing that you led with, which is just like, this is a completely nonsensical system that we allow to be perpetrated on us. And it's only for the last 30-ish years. I just did this piece on taking the entire vaccine industry into public ownership, or nationalizing the vaccine industry in order to internationalize the vaccine. And there's just research in there that's like, it's mind-boggling that we've allowed this to be perpetrated on ourselves, because the history is so clear. After the 1918 influenza pandemic killed close to 700,000 Americans, somewhere at least 50 million people worldwide. It wasn't out of like some hippie sensibilities that the US government was like, oh, we should do something about this. It was like, hey, we just lost more people to this disease than died in World War I, than US casualties in World War I. So we are going to put resources into finding vaccines and treatments for these diseases. This is a public health system that's how everyone treated things then. It didn't make sense to do it otherwise, because it's like, oh, this isn't a business. And 18 of the 28 vaccines that are currently under use were created in that system. Like, that's the system that created all of the ones that you sort of just take for granted, that we take for granted now. And this is a system that works when taxpayer dollars go in to create things for the public good, right? And again, I'll point out, it wasn't for hippie sensibilities. It was like, this is a national security issue, or just the people who were put at one point during World War II, I can make it really clear, it was held up at sort of the same level as the Manhattan Project, which created nuclear weapons, right? So like, that was the level that pandemics specifically, and preventing pandemics, was held at, which makes perfect sense. Like, look around right now. How could one business ever step in the way of a global pandemic? And we've allowed ourselves to be sold this bill of goods that these corporations are ever going to be able to handle what is necessary for public health. So there is a sort of question in here, which is, I want to loop it back to HIV, which is another pandemic that we're currently living through. And it's just much slower. So you can't see it as easily. But the failures in that, and we've been sold this bill of goods that the pharmaceutical industry can actually deal with pandemics, when we have evidence that they cannot actually stop pandemics. And I want to hear if you think I go too far on that, but I see a very, very narrow utility to pharmaceutical corporations. And in fact, this should be done in the public with small d democratic controls. There's nothing else that can fit the magnitude of the issues that we're talking about.
I think it's critical to have more government oversight than we currently do. And, you're talking about kind of government-led initiatives. And like, the irony of it all is that the US government is actually the largest funder of coronavirus research and development right now. It's not the pharmaceutical corporations, right? It's Operation Warp Speed, which is basically the US taxpayer underwriting billions of dollars for these giant vaccine corporations. And I think it's just so critical to highlight the importance of taxpayer-funded contributions, because they're often erased. And the best example of this is sort of the story which has been developing around, what is commonly called the Moderna vaccine. So I'm sure you all have heard, press release after press release, news story after news story about this Moderna vaccine. And we've been digging into what exactly transpired with Moderna, with this vaccine, or this potential vaccine, I should say. It's still in clinical trials. And it's fascinating stuff, So the story of Moderna is actually, I think, a great example of how pharmaceutical corporations benefit from taxpayer-funded dollars and then turn around and reap enormous benefits from those same taxpayers by charging them exorbitant prices. And so the story of Moderna, it's a small biotech company based in Massachusetts. The company basically uses new technology, new way of making vaccines. I won't get too much into the science, but it is a novel way of doing things. And in fact, it's so novel that when the company was starting, when the scientists who were working on this in academic labs wanted to come up with their own biotech company, some of the earliest funders were actually from the U.S. government. The Department of Defense, through an agency called DARPA, was put in about 25 million at a very early stage to help develop that technology. And so that was all the way back in 2013. And throughout the years that Moderna has been working on its technology, it's gotten public funding, whether it's from the U.S. government or some of the consortiums of international funders. And what's remarkable in this story, which we uncovered partly while I was reading some scientific paper, is that in the scientific paper, there's a section that has conflict of interest disclosures. And so the scientists at Moderna and the scientists at NIH wrote this scientific paper about the vaccine, and they had conflict of interest disclosures. And so I was looking at the conflict of interest disclosures, and it said that some of the NIH scientists, some of the federal scientists, actually had filed patent applications over the vaccine. And so what that means is that the US government essentially was claiming ownership over this vaccine. And if the patents are granted, there's going to be dozens of patents on the vaccines, but some of the core patents will actually belong in part to the US government.
Which means to the US taxpayers.
Exactly. And so this is part of a story that, has been completely erased, because how many people talk about the Moderna vaccine as the NIH vaccine?
Well, and
it is the NIH vaccine.
We don't. And that's why, Zain, I think we should just have a entire media blitz about this alone, because we talk so much about weaponized healthcare, and we talk so much about how much it costs to be healthy in this country. And what you're highlighting is so essential. It's not just that we are paying for this already through our taxes and through our public infrastructure. I know this quote is cliche, but it's still true. We live in a time which is free enterprise for the poor and social supports for the rich. And I think as we're talking, the problem with it is it can seem so erudite and abstract. It's really difficult. Do you feel this way? I assume you live and breathe this stuff, so it probably doesn't feel erudite to you.
Yeah, it's honestly, after working years in this space, you sort of become numb to the reality. But it is extraordinary that these giant corporations get these massive billion-dollar handouts without any sort of oversight,
Yes.
without any meaningful kind of commitments to protect the public interest. You become numb to that idea, but it is actually remarkable, and the sort of irony about the Moderna story is that that's not it. So not only did the NIH, help, not only did the NIH scientists work hand in hand with Moderna to actually come up with the vaccine itself. And so, there's a story I believe in June that we put out with Axios that clearly showed, look, the NIH is claiming ownership. The NIH has rights and responsibilities here. A group we work with called Knowledge Ecology International then FOIA'd, filed Freedom of Information Act requests with one of the government agencies that was funding Moderna. So we get this 100-page contract, mostly redacted because, confidential information. But in that contract, we also find something else. In that contract, it clearly states that when, as a condition of receiving funding, Moderna in its press releases, the contractor in its press releases, has to disclose how much it is funding and how much it is receiving from the US government, and what is the percentage of each. And so this is sort of the key to the whole scenario, right? Is how much is the US government funding and how much is the private sector funding? And so you can sort of, assess and determine what is going on. And what we found, of course, is that Moderna was not complying with that requirement. Moderna was not saying how much of its own money it's putting in, and Moderna was not saying how much the US government is putting in as a percentage amount. And so we wrote to the US government, and we actually got a response. We got a response from the head of BARDA.
What did they say?
And they said, we will, thanks for raising this to our attention. Trust is critical. and we will be in touch with the company and we'll ensure their compliance. And one of the remarkable things that to come out of it was that Moderna essentially came out and said, BARDA is funding 100% of the contract that we are working on. And if you look at the contract that they're working on, it goes all the way from like clinical trials all the way to FDA approval. And so they just fully came out and said, BARDA is doing it.
It's
and
all our money, 100%.
Yeah.
It should never be called the Moderna vaccine. And I want to point this out because Zain is Zain. He did it, so he might not have highlighted his role enough. It's literally 100% our vaccine. But as of right now, some corporate executive is going to get to set a price, which they promised is going to be reasonable. And it's going to be restricted to just that company and its logistical supply chain and its manufacturing supply chain. And there are billions of people who need this vaccine, and this little biotech is not going to be able to pull it off. But we keep calling it the Moderna vaccine. Zane's reading a paper, and he sees that, in fact, there's nothing that Moderna has done. They've done nothing except take our money and call it the Moderna vaccine. So yes, there was research done, paid for by us. The work product is the American people's. And this is like, I can't stress enough that this is not rare. This is not, I don't want to get too into the weeds on this one, but just as an example, do you remember when Jamie Love runs Knowledge Ecology International? He one time got a redacted document that was, I can't remember how he did it. It was poorly redacted. So he just had to click like on PDF and the redactions came off and he could read what was redacted. And it was a contract that said it's a gene therapy and they were going to charge astronomical numbers for it. And they just made it all up. And when they disclosed it, they just redacted the part of the contract that had a reasonable pricing clause in it that said that you had to actually, in order to get the government money, you have to make sure that people can afford that. And they just blocked it out. And they're like, we'll just forget about that part. And if it wasn't for Jamie Love, clicking a button in the PDF to expose that, it would have gotten away with it, because they always get away with it because it's perpetrated on us. It is a structural violence perpetrated on the global, everyone around the globe. And in America, we pay the highest drug prices in the world, but around the globe, and I'd like to get into some global public health here, Zain, if you don't mind. What you see, especially with HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, the big three, and is that the pharmaceutical corporations are the causative agent in millions of premature death just to increase profits. And at the end of the day, most of the drugs that they're restricting access to for profit are ours to begin with. We paid for them. We are the ones who paid the scientists who discovered all of these things. And then we just let these companies perpetrate violence on the people by restricting access to them. I mean, it's absurd. And now we're living in the proof positive that these companies cannot ever fulfill their obligation to the public health. They physically cannot deal with a pandemic. If there is a vaccine, and when I go off on my rants on pharma, I at some point usually have to dial it back and say, I love science. Don't get me wrong. What I love about these molecules and the pharmaceuticals is that they're close to magic. We have been able to do amazing things. I worked in HIV clinics. I saw the power of antiretrovirals take a person's T cells, their immune system, from non-existent back, the Lazarus effect. I saw it with my own eyes. It's close to magical what we can do to help people's health, but we choose not to do it. We can. Pills cost pennies to produce, but we choose not to do it. We choose to allow these corporations to restrict access because it's too hard to challenge them. And in fact, it's, Zain, literally Zain is the one who was reading this disclosure and put it together. Like, why isn't the whole system? Why didn't the entire grant making structure that gave Moderna the money, why didn't they say, hey, where is this in your press release, right? The corruption that is at the root of that is also something. So a million angles, Zain, if you want to take it where you want to go. But like what you've exposed with this Moderna is not an isolated case. It's how the system works.
Yeah, and I think it has really tragic consequences as well. Like, of course, we want to reward innovation, and if that innovation is coming from the private sector, sure, we'll pay for it. But the question has to be, how much is too much? If we're putting in so much of the money, if we're driving some of this innovation, should we have to pay twice? If Moderna has come up with the platform, sure, we acknowledge that they did that before. But who is actually taking the risk right now? Who is actually paying the money? And so we know, for example, that the US government put in about $1.5 billion on the Moderna vaccine so far, on the Moderna/NIH vaccine. And now Moderna and the US government have announced that the US government is actually going to purchase more vaccine from Moderna for $1.5 billion more. And right now it's only for 100 million doses, and that contract can be extended up to $8 billion. And so the question is, if we took the risk, if the taxpayers funded the development, then why are we willing to hand another $8 billion to this corporation to sell us back the doses that we helped develop? And the crazy part here is that we didn't just develop it either. We actually are helping manufacture these things. The US government is actually funding COVID-19 vaccine factories. Like, that's the depth of the US government investment. And I think one of the real tragedies here is that this is publicly funded science, and so it should be in the public domain. And what I mean by that is that if someone comes up with the vaccine recipe, right? If someone comes up with a vaccine recipe and it turns out to be, a safe and effective vaccine, no one corporation can actually supply the world. It's just not possible, right? There's no way that one small company, especially one small biotech, there is absolutely no way. And so if we actually want that public good to be available to everyone in the world, then we need to radically rethink the system, right? We need as many qualified manufacturers as possible to churning out that vaccine recipe. We need that vaccine to be produced everywhere as quickly as possible if it turns out to be safe and effective. And that's not the current model. The current model is, if that vaccine turns out to be safe and effective, then this one corporation is going to have a monopoly. This one corporation is going to set the price. It's going to have, set the terms for supply, set the terms for its contracts. And it's going to be a nightmare. It's going to be a nightmare. We're talking right now about Moderna, but realistically, whoever comes up with the vaccine first based on, taxpayer dollars, there's not going to be enough supply.
Well, think about, let me just jump in for just you, because we started with Remdesivir. Remdesivir shortens a hospitalization stay by, I think the median is 3 days, right? Like, which is great. But again, think of that. It's very, very modest what it does. There are shortages of Remdesivir all over this country because one company is producing it. And all it does is shortens the hospital stay of people who are severely ill with COVID-19, and we can't supply enough of that. When we have a vaccine that is safe and effective, which actually prevents the infection of COVID-19, and we need to vaccinate the world, then you're going to see shortages on a scale that I think are going to be criminally horrible, right?
Well, and I think
we're going to see that.
The trend that is already Zain, I'm sorry, this is your field of expertise as a public health expert, but what we're going to see is what we're already seeing. You're going to have upper middle class people and other affluent people being largely insulated from the impacts of this, and you're going to see poor people dying in overwhelming numbers. And that's already happening. We're seeing this in this country. The clusters of COVID deaths and COVID infection rates are primarily in places where people are, one, essential workers, so they're more likely to be exposed, communities of color, the elderly, nursing homes. Alex, I know this is your jam. And so you end up with this situation where some parts of the country are know tons of people who've been infected with COVID, tons of people who haven't been vaccinated. In some parts of the country where it's like, oh, is this still going on? I wasn't aware. And what our government is fundamentally saying when they do this is we actually don't care if poor people die in large numbers. And that is chilling. That should terrify all of us.
Finish the last part of give us the hope, because I'm actually hopeful on this one. With all that fire.
Was that hopeful?
Because the shortages are going to be so bad that, and again, I don't want to get into the complexities of the RNA vaccine technologies, but there's logistical complexities that don't exist in other, right? But it's going to take absolutely a global effort, and it'll become apparent very quickly that, viruses don't care at all about borders or anything. So if we want to stop a pandemic, we can't. It's impossible that the current system can stop a pandemic.
I'll conclude with a story. The story of HIV/AIDS. In the 90s, as Alex alluded to, these new drugs came out for HIV/AIDS, and they were miraculous. It was literally called the Lazarus effect, because people who took these new drugs, which were publicly funded, they had remarkable effects. It was like they rose from the dead, essentially. And those drugs were priced largely out of reach for millions of people all around the world by these giant pharmaceutical corporations. In the time, I think it was 1997, it was $10,000, which looking back seems like nothing because drug prices are just astronomical now. But at the time, $10,000 for people around the world were just completely out of reach. And this was happening despite the fact that the epidemic was particularly ravaging sub-Saharan Africa. So in South Africa, where I spent a year working on these issues, 20 years later, in 2000, more people were dying in their 30s and 40s than were dying in their 60s and 70s. Just think about that. Think about what it does to a society when more people in their 30s and 40s are dying than their 60s and 70s. There were literally lineups at graveyards because they could not bury the young quick enough. And so while this was going on, they had medicines that were available that could have saved these millions of people, and they were entirely unavailable. And this is despite the fact that those medicines could be produced for pennies a pill. And in fact, there were Indian suppliers who wanted to produce those same drugs for literally $1 a day, and they were unable to do so. They were unable to introduce those drugs because of these restricted patent laws. And where the hope comes in is that we actually fought back, and by we, I mean like the activists and legends who came before me, who took on these giant pharmaceutical corporations. And even when they were trying to sue Nelson Mandela to restrict, laws to import generic medicines, a small ragtag group of activists from all over the world came together and they took on the pharmaceutical industry. They essentially told the pharmaceutical industry, you have to stop, this is unconscionable. And they forced governments to have us fine. And as a result, what we've seen in HIV/AIDS is actually miraculous. At the time in 2000, I mentioned in South Africa just the devastation that was going on because of the lack of access to medicine. But now, in 2019 and 2020, South Africa has the world's largest HIV/AIDS treatment program, right? There's 5 million people on HIV/AIDS treatment because they were able to afford low-cost generic HIV medicines. And that was all possible because of the work that was done 20 years ago. And so I think the COVID-19 moment demands something similar from all of us, which is that, are we going to take action? Are we going to make sure that everyone gets access to the medicines that they need as quickly as possible? Because at the end of the day, this is not a national epidemic. This is a pandemic. It affects all people all around the world. And we need to make sure that the pharmaceutical corporations that we largely fund for their COVID-19 treatment and vaccines make those treatments and vaccines widely available at an affordable price to everyone.
Zain, I can't thank you enough for being on. I know we've had 2 conversations about this week, but there's a lot to talk about. And I appreciate that story of hope, because I do think that been reading about this all week. I think that our way forward is to take our cues from the HIV activism that sort of laid the groundwork for where we're going next. How can people support your work and get involved helping with this fight?
There's kind of the standard spiel about, get in touch with your member of Congress and, and like demand that they have.
Camp out in their office. Don't make it.
There are good pieces of legislation. There's the MAP Act, there's a TRACK Act, and those pieces of legislation, it would increase transparency, they would increase qualified suppliers, so there's no monopolies. And I think beyond that, I think it's a conceptual thing. I think it's really important for people to understand just how deeply our taxpayer dollars go in this situation. And I think it's important not to lose sight of the fact that this is a global emergency. Things are bad in the US, things are really bad. But they are bad everywhere. They're really bad in a lot of countries. And so it's incredibly important for our solidarity to extend not to just those people who are around us, but to all people in these really difficult and unprecedented times.
Zain, thank you so much for joining us on Solidarity Live and ending with a note of solidarity. In that show of solidarity, I'd also say support Public Citizen and Zain's work directly at publiccitizen.org and learn more about everything that's going on. They have a great tracker tracking the actual dollar amounts of going into the vaccine development. But I want to, Jocelyn, as we sign off, Zain, and I want to agree with everything that he said and that you closed with, but say that we have to take it one more. We have to take what we learned from HIV activism, but we didn't finish the fight when it came to HIV drugs. And actually, it was able to be diverted back towards pharma, where we actually now are seeing that access in the rich parts of the world is sort of the metric. And as long as people are on treatment, we could end HIV. We could defeat the disease if we actually remove the profit motive and these corporations completely from the picture, or otherwise just shrink them down small enough that they're basically over here on the side. And we're actually putting all of our small d democratic power behind taking on these pandemics and ending them, because the scale of damage and harm that they cause is so much bigger than the investment that it would take to fight them, as long as we're not diverted by these corporations into sort of just sustaining something. And in times of great crisis is when you can see the power of solidarity most clearly. And at a global crisis level, that's when we can see, as Zain said, an opportunity for global solidarity in a way that we've never seen in modern times. That's where the hope is for me, that we can take what we've learned, but push it further and finish the job to create a public pharmaceutical sector that actually is aimed at the public health and not at private profits at all.
Yes, our tweet, I'm with you. I mean, look, I think that the reality is this is God, look, this is the problem with it though. And this is, you and I talk about this all the time. You can't, it's so overwhelming. The trend is simple. The trend is happening in every single industry in American life, whether it's elder care or healthcare or education, of privatization serving as a way to sort of crush the poor out of their own humanity. But like the details are very boring. And that is what makes it difficult, I think, for people to really wrap their minds around. Like, how do you go up to people and are like, hey, like, these are all the companies that are trying to kill you? It's overwhelming.
I think you need a really great soundtrack. I'm
Oh,
thinking
I like that.
of our introduction to our show that Brad put the video to the song that Brock made. I'm serious though about the fact that it can't be, because it's very difficult on purpose, right? The complexities of the system are created to disincentivize action, and actually to incentivize individual action, siloed individual action, but to disincentivize collective action, systemic reforms and structural reforms.
And to incentivize shame. This is
Absolutely.
why I am so tired of everybody. Like this idea that, oh, if you take enough individual responsibility, crushing capitalism can't happen to you. That's not how it works, especially in the midst of a pandemic. And it's been really shocking to me the way we are so quickly to accept that these structural, globally pressing problems can be avoided with individual action if we're just like the right type of worker, the right type of citizen. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah, and it actually is again, it's the corporate pushback that started in the 70s was aimed specifically at the successes of the collective action that was happening through the 60s into the 70s, and the corporate retranchement, the reactionary part that we're still in, really started under Nixon, but accelerated, actually maybe started under Carter. It's a little bit difficult to say where the boundaries are, but you can say for certain that at Ronald Reagan, we're fully going backwards. And corporations are just sucking all of the money out of our pockets. Productivity is still going up, up, up. Wages are flat. The bosses are getting fat off of the labor of the workers at a level that hadn't existed since the last age of inequality of the robber barons before. And now we have the same. We have the private equity barons. We have the tech barons, but they're all based on monopoly power. And again, they're all also perversions of public resources, the internet developed by US taxpayers. But instead of making it a utility as it should be, and access to it, a public good that we paid for in developing it, again through DARPA, we allow these corporations to hoard it and to restrict access to make money so that they can become obscenely wealthy, wealthier than any non-sick person could ever want.
Well, and it's like I keep thinking about the psychological aspect of this because I can't help it. And I think that we have to accept that extreme wealth is a mental illness. Like once you are in control of a certain or aspiring to a certain amount of extreme wealth, you are no longer vying for the common good the way a middle class person or a working class person is interested in just a basic amount of material stability. So you have these people who, like you're saying, Alex, like they're not just profiting a little bit. As Sanjeev always says this when he's on our show, the COVID quarter has been exceptionally good for healthcare companies. Overwhelmingly good. It's not like they're sort of doing well. They are literally making billions of dollars off of our inability to pay for our own well-being. It's blood money.
And billionaires are increasing their wealth astronomically during the pandemic times. The part that I think Zain and my work in public health brings to the front, that is another aspect that people don't believe enough, and it allows things to be perpetrated on us, is the idea, an understanding that we pay for the stuff, that the developments that happen, that like name one, the ATM is something that you can give like entirely to the private sector that was an innovation. I'll give that one. But other than that, you're looking at stuff that we pay for with taxpayer dollars. They're publicly funded things, and the internet, DARPA, the COVID vaccine that people call the Moderna vaccine, but all of those vaccines that are RNA technology based, that's based on research that we paid for. Remember the EpiPen, when it became a big story that people couldn't afford the EpiPen because these criminal CEOs were charging astronomical amounts of money because they knew that parents of children with peanut allergies would literally pay to their last dollar to protect their children from death for one of these epinephrine pens. Guess who developed that one? Again, the taxpayers through DOD. Again, that the cartridge that you inject the epinephrine in was developed for soldiers for a nerve agent antidote. And then we gave it to the private sector, who then charges what they want. This story repeats over and over and over again. The oil barons of the robber baron era, the railroad barons, all of that is public. The only way that they made money is they corrupted politicians who would give them rights to exploit resources that were public resources, but we hand them over to the private sector to make an elite group enormously wealthy, and the people pay for that. And we're seeing it over, and it's always the same story. I'm just saying America. You can go further back.
It's not, I mean, like, this is all I think about when I encounter these free enterprise, private equity, whatever, weirdo frat boy douchebags. It's like, I love what you're saying. Thank you. I that is the professional term, correct? It's like, okay, so it makes good intellectual theoretical sense that the private industry would be able to do all these great muscular feats of ingenuity, except for the fact that is never how it has played out. Like, I get it. Silicon Valley, what an exciting thing. But that is not, the material details matter. The logistics of how things happen matter. And it is absolutely fundamentally not the case that there is some brilliant man, some Howard Rourke, who strides into the middle of a problem and with, all his capital and all his ingenuity solves it for the public good. It has never worked that way. Like, why do people not get this, Alex?
I don't know. It's easy once you start seeing it. You should like seeing the financialization, where you start understanding that Wall Street and the private equity barons profit off of misery and destruction. And so behind bad things, you'll always find the same actors. And then the story of personal failings, like, oh yeah, it was actually because of the people, they did these things that were bad. And you're like, no, that's not at all what happened. There is a vulture class of useless people. They just are sitting on wealth, and all they do is prey on other people. And in times past, we used to be much more honest about the uselessness of idle wealth, that it was really dangerous to let idle capital acquire an advantage over working labor, so much so that working labor could never catch up. That's what leads to what we saw before 1918 and the First World War. That's when a society ossifies and you get these idiot, useless, rich people who can do nothing. They're absolute failures, except that they're sitting on enough money that the money just makes money. And so they can't fail anymore.
Yes.
But the way that money makes money is through predation.
Well, but
it has to be wielded against the people.
I will never forgive whatever insane, narcissistic pseudo-meritocrat came up with the idea that material success is equated to some form of ingenuity or industry. Because that, for me, is the identifying villainous myth of our time. Because as you said, Alex, there was a time when we were more honest about the fact that really rich people, even if they did somehow earn it by creating a very wonderful, successful company, there is no way to equate certain amounts of capital to work. It doesn't work like that. Like, let's say somebody has a great idea. There's no way they had $1 trillion idea. That's not a thing. But because Americans have internalized that so deeply, we are not looking at the vulture class as the villains they are. We're looking at them as people who must be some form of financial savant.
Of Ubermensch, yeah.
Ubermensch.
And
There is no Ubermensch.
none.
Not a one.
They have, put on two different color socks just like the rest of us.
I do that all the time.
But yours is on purpose. I think that we were even more honest if the further back you go, and when you're reading that, there was no ability to, no, he started a company and earned it. Like, we used to understand that was not at all how it was. And you can read, Enlightenment and philosophers. The true thing was that somebody drew a fence around a piece of land that used to be a public good that everyone could use and said, that's mine. And
Yes.
when that happened, it all goes from there to now. Whoever was able to inherit that, and it would build wealth over the generations. But then they had to come up with a myth to say, okay, well, these two individuals, you compare the two of them and they're identical, but this person is a lord and owns all of the labor of the people who live on this land by right, by birthright. And that leads all the way to when the people are like, that's stupid. That person who's a lord is an idiot. And when people rise up against that idea, that's when you see this fundamental change. That's where I am hopeful that we are in a place where people are starting to see that these vulture class private equity barons, they're not only ripping money out of our pockets, they're also not useful. They're not smart. They're not brilliant. They're not organizing things. If you can look at the failure, the abject failure that is the US response to COVID, and be like, oh, somebody is in charge and knows what they're doing. Like, no. We have abdicated our responsibility for collectively taking care of ourselves because we're just, somebody's got that under control, I'm sure. I'm positive that it can't just be asleep at the wheel.
And I hate to bring Aristotle into everything because it's a very Catholic impulse, but the middle class, I'm telling you, they know where it's at. And part of burgeoning the American middle class is because, look, as a former poor, when you're super poor, you don't have the mental capacity to solve really complex problems. A free and just society would allow everybody to have their needs met, everybody to educate their children, everybody to have the health care they need, and participate in democracy. But nobody needs to be a billionaire. Nobody needs to be a trillionaire. That is fundamentally unnecessary. And what you will find, this exorbitant lie that if people aren't motivated by trillions of dollars, they won't work. What you will find is that people are motivated. We, in the human spirit, there is this desire to create, to invent, to come up with solutions to complicated problems. And if we had an America that was free of the just ridiculous predation of the upper class, you would have an America that was free to solve a lot of these problems themselves. Instead of, as you're saying, Alex, outsource them to insane psychopaths who got straight C's at whatever Ivy League they falsely were admitted into.
Yeah, Jared Kushner is like the perfect example of this.
The genius.
I think what you're talking about is also, we should see, we can lose too. The people, if we don't stand in solidarity, the vulture class are very powerful. And what they want is to reduce it so that people don't have the time to solve collectively the problems, right? They want to keep people poor enough and struggling enough that they don't have even an extra second to spend on time to try to build collective power to take on the structure, the system. And that is, you can say it's a cheap labor pool or whatever it is. That's what the vulture class wants. And we've allowed businesses not to compete for ideas or widgets or anything. They're literally just competing on where they can locate their labor that has the cheapest labor with the least protections for workers, so that's what corporations are competing on, right? Who can offshore their labor down far enough so that the workers make nothing and all the money goes to the C-suite. And that's a choice. We can reverse that very easily and say, no, actually, corporations need to compete on quality of product and usefulness to the consumer, right? Like Brad and I were complaining about Twitter just a bit before the show. If you try to contact Twitter, like try to tell me who do you call or how do you get in contact with Twitter, it's impossible. That is not a system, like we need to build products and a system that work for the people. And you can take that all the way down to businesses. Businesses right now realize that that's not what they're competing on. They can lose customers by being bad as long as their labor is so cheap that they can make up for it by exploiting their labor.
I love that you bring this up because I think about this when I have a, this was Elizabeth Warren's big thing, consumer protection. There is almost nil consumer protection in this country. I can't tell you how many times I've signed up for like an online subscription to something or was charged the wrong amount. And it's like you're saying, there's no one to talk to. They don't care. There is no, like, people can just be like, oh, I'm just going to take $200 out of your account. I'm like, what are you going to do about it? That is a society that we have normalized. And I think people are like, well, wasn't it always like that? No, it was not. It absolutely was not. For all the fact that we have had all these systems of oppression for hundreds of years, this very fundamental idea of it doesn't matter how you treat other people is relatively new. It is a part of the breakdown and this ethos that it is an important, fundamentally important thing to be a human being and treat other human beings well. Like we've lost that, and we've lost that in the fetishization of tremendous material wealth. I don't understand, because for me, if you're a miserable human being, what is the point of having all that?
They don't, I don't think it's a mental illness. I say a sickness, but it's a compulsion. I don't know, Rich, the system changed in 1980, though. I know that. Yes. Reagan, Thatcher. And it started selecting for those people who cared least about other people and empowering them so that the financial sector and, importantly, the pharmaceutical sector, which is actually just private equity. That people think that the pharmaceutical sector is people in lab coats. It's not. It's people in $6,000 suits, and they buy up people in lab coats. And we need to fundamentally go back to a system where it's all public health. And we don't allow the financialization of the pharmaceutical industry at all. I think that we can have a very narrow place for corporations to exist, but the primary work of public health would not be done at all in service of a corporate bottom line. It would just be done in service of public health. That's the only way we can prevent the next pandemic. It's the only way we can get out of this current pandemic. And it'll pay dividends to millions of Americans who can't afford their drugs and billions of people around the world with better health. The magnitude of the evil that it takes to literally withhold access to a molecule, a drug that you know could save millions of people's lives. As Zain said, in the case of antiretroviral therapies for HIV, these corporations made a choice. They knew it. It's a psychopathic choice that they made, but they wanted another yacht. And our system allowed them to do that. So we need to change the system. Those psychopaths are always going to exist. We just can create a system that doesn't let them be in charge.
I love that you say that, because that is so important. There's this great quote, and it's borne out by so many social psychologists. There will always be a third of the population that's overwhelmingly empathic and heroic. There will always be a third of the population that's overwhelmingly selfish and manipulative and maladaptive. There will always be a third that's somewhere in the middle. That's never going to change. You're never going to change the moral breakdown of the human machine. What you can do is change who's driving it. And that's a really important thing. I don't want to be driven off the cliff by a horde of crazy psychopaths. It is not in my best interest or yours.
And I mean, just we'll go back into bleak in the last minute, and then you can send us off in hope. But we talked about pharma and the pharmaceutical corporations, and the answer is public pharma. And the way we get there is through solidarity. Look at the West right now. It's literally on fire. Climate has changed. It's changed, people. It's not changing. The West is on fire. It's going to get worse. It is bad now, and it's getting worse. And it's not magic. It's an industry. It's the extractive industry that's doing this to us. It's being perpetrated on us. It's violence. And it's policy choices that allow that industry to do it to us. We subsidize the profits of the industries that are causing the West to be on fire. I want everyone to understand that. It's taxpayer dollars that undergird all the oil companies, all the coal companies, which are going away. If we stopped subsidizing these companies, they'd be replaced quite quickly with technology that doesn't cause these enormous externalities. And that's all we have to do. We need people to stand up and recognize that we're being punched in the face by a bunch of wimpy billionaires over and over again, because we're like, oh, I think that's the way it's always been. It's not always been this way. And we're going to build a better way. We're going to build a way that it's never been before, where it's truly responsive to the people, all people, not just some people, but all people, except for maybe those psychopaths over there. We'll let them, they could go onto Libertarian Island, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think they should go to an island and test out their own ideology. I think it would be a lovely political experiment for them. I do have a lot of hope, because if there's one thing I think about a lot, it's that every single generation has had fights that seemed hopeless, but were won anyway, through solidarity and through mutual collaboration. And that's what we're here to do. I mean, there has never been a time in history where these evil people weren't doing some messed up nonsense in some capacity. So we just have to fix this one paradigm for this one generation and leave other problems to our children. So thank you so much for being here with us today, you guys. We love you, and we'll see you next Friday.